Hey, my name is Brennan, and you're listening to the Astrology Podcast. In this episode, I'm going to do a live chart reading webinar with patrons of the Astrology Podcast, where we're going to talk about fourth house placements in their birth chart, as well as transits through the fourth house. And I'm going to interview them and discuss how those placements have worked out in their lives by focusing in on specific examples of how those placements have manifested. So this is kind of like a precursor because I'm currently in the process of researching my upcoming episode on the fourth house in astrology, which I'm largely going to focus on using celebrity charts, just like I have in the past few examples, few episodes of like the first house, the second house, and the third house, because I prefer to use celebrity examples for those big episodes because then the lives of celebrities or notable figures are well documented and there's like a shared point of reference so that you can kind of confirm or deny what I'm saying about their life so that there's a certain aspect of like reliability to that for research purposes. But the other half of things is that you can actually get a lot more detail and nuance when you can actually talk to a person directly about their birth chart. So that's why I like doing these live chart reading sessions with patrons of the Astrology Podcast who signed up through my page on Patreon, because then I can actually ask them questions and we can have a dialogue about their life, which sometimes results in a much deeper understanding of the nuances surrounding those placements. So that's one of the reasons why I do these episodes. So the fourth house, some of the significations of the fourth house as it pertains to the home, the family, the living situation, and the private life are essentially the primary significations of the fourth house. So let me share a diagram that shows this is my basic significations of the fourth house. We see the fourth house is down at the bottom part of the chart. It's in the part of the chart that's completely under the earth, and spatially is basically the spot directly below your feet, essentially, is where the fourth house is. So it's the most hidden part of the chart and can represent your home and your private life. And it's opposite to the 10th house, which represents your public life because it's the most visible part of the chart, since that's basically like the middle of the sky right above you. So that's an important dynamic. 10th house public life, fourth house private life. The fourth house is also your roots. It's kind of like the roots of a tree. If you're imagining a tree, then the fourth house would be where the roots are going into the ground. And as a result of that, it represents your parents, but also sometimes larger themes of ancestry and your past and your family lineage can come up when it comes to the fourth house, which is kind of an interesting topic. I think that's it. Why don't we then jump into some of the first chart examples? So I have a group of patrons that are attending today, and I've already had some submit examples. And Travis, I think we're going to start with you. So I'm going to promote you to a panelist now, and then we can talk about your chart and your fourth house placements. There we go. Hey,
All right. Hi.
thanks for joining me.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.
All right. What's your birth data?
My birth data is October 21st, 1992,
What time?
1:46 a.m.,
And what place?
Knoxville, Tennessee.
All right. And is your ascendant 12 Leo?
Yes, it is.
All right. So here is your birth chart for those watching the video version. For those listening to the audio version, we have a chart with Leo rising, and we have Mercury Pluto conjunction in the fourth whole sign house in the sign of Scorpio. So Mercury is at 19 Scorpio and Pluto's at 21. And the degree of the IC is down at 4 degrees of Scorpio, also in the fourth whole sign house. So, yeah, how has this worked out for you, or what was the primary thing about this that you wanted to share?
I think the primary thing, especially as I've been reading, like Saul, has been understanding, I guess, connecting the fourth. My father's kind of So my father left his hometown when he was very young. He was probably like 17 years old or 18 years old. He came down to Tennessee. He eventually met and married my mother, but there's this level of exile, right,
Mm,
going on. And he grew up in a pretty difficult set of circumstances in his immediate family, and part of them he replicated in my upbringing. Um, and so I'd say that the connection between Mars and Mercury was very there. It very much influenced the way that I thought. Um, my father was very influential in my upbringing. Um, but ironically, or by the same token, with the same hand, I developed a very deep interest in genealogy when I was very little as a child. Um, and so I think I had like an ancestry.com account when I was maybe like 13 or 14. And I was interested in like lineage and stuff like that even before then. So on my father's side and on my mother's side, both. But it came with,
nice.
yeah, plenty of intensity, I would say.
I love that. Yeah, I've been talking a lot recently. I think I did in the last episode just about Mercury Pluto conjunctions and aspects being like the investigator or the Sherlock Holmes type aspect. And what was funny about that is I actually discovered that the author of the Sherlock Holmes stories has Gemini rising and Mercury conjunct Pluto in, I believe it was in like Taurus in the 12th house, and he developed like the Sherlock Holmes character. So I've been using that metaphor lately for Mercury Pluto conjunctions, and it's funny that like you have that, but it's in the fourth house, which relates to one's family and ancestry, and it's like from a
Mm-hmm.
young age you became an investigator of your family lineage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
What drew you to that, or what was it that spoke to you about that? Do you remember?
Um, so I'll be very clear. I'm actually recovering from a concussion, so bear with me if I like struggle a bit. But as far as I can remember, I just always was interested in, I guess, like the elderly members of my family. I was very close with my maternal, whoops, sorry, my pups are like excited. My maternal grandmother and stuff like that. So I suppose in talking with people that were um, older and feeling very like intimately connected with them, I I don't know. I think just listening to their stories and being like, okay, well, what was her mother's name and what did she look like? And then, when people passed, having to find it out for myself. There are things that people forget, things that people don't have immediate access to, and I wanted to learn that. And I'd say that that skill, that investigative skill, that came with like digging through my ancestry and all the different connections, patterned itself in the rest of my life as well, including when I was in university.
So you're able to like take some of those skills that you learned early on with doing that type of intense research and then apply it to other things later on.
Yeah, definitely. I'd say that that was, yeah, hugely influential.
Nice. That makes sense. And then in terms of some of the challenges with your father, so you have Scorpio in the fourth house, and then the ruler is Mars, which is over in Cancer in the 12th house in the sign of its fall, although it is in a night chart. So Mars is not the most challenging planet, but
Hmm.
nonetheless, it's a somewhat challenging placement since it's in the 12th house, although that trine with Mercury does give some mitigation being configured to an angular planet. But how far was it that he moved? You said he moved far enough across the country that it was kind of like in exile compared to where he started.
500 miles. So about 8 hours away by car. Although back in the day when he moved here, I can't really be sure how much longer it might have taken. But by today's speed limit, about 8 hours, but 500 miles, almost exactly.
Got it. And the 12th house tends to have some more challenging signification. So traditionally, it's like the place of enemies or people that you don't get along with. It can be the house that has to do with mental issues as opposed to
Mhm.
like physical issues, which is more of the sixth house. And it can also pertain to places of solitude or isolation, which can refer to like sometimes to
Mhm.
like prisons or other times to hospitals or other things like that. So do any of those topics came up in major themes, either in his life or in terms of your relationship with him?
Yeah, I'd say so. My father worked in mental health. He was a social worker for, I want to say, maybe 30 years. Um, and I would say definitely in again this kind of dual sword type of way that he worked in mental health. He also suffered from mental health issues, and in the way that the way that things can progress, like had an influence on the mental health of his kids, and yeah, so a very interesting sort of thing. Additionally, I have like historically speaking a very strong interest in like prison and prison abolition, uh,
Mm,
um, and like I guess theories surrounding that, right? And policing, theories of policing, right? So yeah, these are all things more related to like a university setting. That Mars is also like the Lord of the Ninth House, um, but
right. Like
but
your
yeah, so definitely.
philosophical views in terms of that.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Well, that's really interesting that he worked in mental health, and that's a very, because that's a more that kind of fits the manifestations that I sometimes see like with like the sixth house, where sometimes when a person has a important placement there and it's mitigated. I had a famous example of like a doctor, for example, that had the ruler of the 10th house and the sixth house, but they worked with people that were, in difficult health positions for much of their life. And so it was sort of focused in that sense. So it's interesting that for him, he worked there in that context for 30 years. Um,
Hmm.
yeah, so there's like a positive manifestation of that as well as the more challenging manifestation that you were also talking about.
Hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah. Brilliant. And then earlier, did you say your interest in genealogy came about initially as a result of interactions with did you say your grandparents?
So not so when I was born, I had three surviving grandparents. And I think the initial interest in kind of like people that were older and their experiences came from my maternal grandmother. But the kind of linchpin with that, so she was the grandparent that was near to me. My paternal grandparents were 500 miles away, so I would see them, but infrequently. Uh, so on the one hand, on a personal level, there's this closeness with my maternal grandmother, who was very present while she was alive. And then my father and his side of the family were pretty well. My father, particularly, was very into genealogy, very into history, generally speaking. And he would talk about the older people in his life. He would talk about his great aunts, his great uncles, and stuff like that. And I think it just kind of went from there. So on the one side of my family, I had a personal interest and very close relationship and understanding and interest in the elderly. And then on the other side of my family, I had a bunch of documentation and a bunch of resources that already existed among the elderly in my family, and that I also inherited, like books and the like. And then I took it from there
Brilliant.
myself.
Brilliant. Because one of the things I was curious about is just you also have an emphasis on the third house in your chart, since you have the ruler of your ascendant as the sun, which is in Libra in the third house, and you also have Jupiter and a lot of fortune there. And something Lisa and I were talking about in the third house episode and sort of debating is that the third house represents siblings, but also
Mm-hmm.
extended family and relatives, and the question sometimes of whether like grandparents are fourth house or whether they're third house. And I was leaning more towards third house,
Mm-hmm.
which would be interesting for you with your ruler of the ascendant there, as well as the lot of fortune. But it was a little bit unclear. How has the third house come into play for you in terms of like siblings, extended family, neighbors, and short distance travel?
So in terms of siblings, I have a single sibling. who is actually also a sun sign Libra. But that
Nice.
aside, yeah, so I have the sibling. That element is definitely there. Definitely has that. If we lean traditionally, that triplicity support that seems to play out in his chart as well. But in terms of neighborhood, I'm I'd say I live in a like a middle class suburb from the 60s. So pretty nice is what I'm saying. Um, Not necessarily yeah, like while I was growing up, it was more full of elderly people. There weren't very many young people. We had inherited this house from the maternal grandmother I previously mentioned.
Mhm.
Um, and so, on the one hand, I grew up in a suburb, which was pretty nice. And on the other hand, I grew up with virtually zero people my age in the area. Um, and then I mentioned that I have my single living sibling. Uh, and in terms of extended kin, um, I mean, I'm trying to think. I have them. My father's kin are 500 miles away, but my mother's kin were in this area.
Mhm.
Um, they are generally speaking older than me. The ones that might have been my age or have kind of moved away or didn't live here, if that makes sense. But yeah.
Got it. Okay. Cool. All right. I think all of that makes sense. And yeah, I love that that drew out just some of those themes of ancestry because it's one that I always see come up. Like sometimes it's like a temporary thing, like a person will have a major transit through the fourth house, and all of a sudden they'll just
Mhm.
become interested in ancestry for a very brief period of time in their life. But for you to have it happen so young as a result of those placements and be more impactful is really, really fascinating.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you for sharing that example. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
All right, cool. All right. That was an awesome example to start with. Um, Let me check and see who is next. So I asked my audience to hit the like button to let me know which examples they can kind of vote on which examples I do next. Um, all right. And it looks like the next most upvoted one that the audience wanted me to do next was Samantha.
Hi.
Hey, thanks for joining me.
Hi. Thank you for having me.
What is your chart data?
So birthday is 11/15/1994, and I was born in Caloocan, Caloocan city in the Philippines.
Okay. So is your ascendant 21 Virgo?
No, my birthday. So my birth time was actually forged by my father, which is funny now that we talk about father in the fourth house. On my birthday, on my real birth time was a little bit after midnight. So I've been putting about like 12:03 a.m. November
1203.
15th. Hmm.
Okay. Is it 26 Leah?
Yes.
Got it. Okay. All right. Let me share your chart. There we go. All right. So for those listening to the audio version, we have a chart with 26 Leo rising, and there's a stellium of planets in Scorpio in the fourth whole sign house that includes Venus, Mercury, the North Node, the Sun, Jupiter, the IC, and Pluto all lined
Mhm.
up more or less in a row there. Um, yeah. So what is your example?
Um, so my birth time on my birth certificate, it was my father's idea to change it to November 14th because on his side of the family, there's a group of about 10 people born on November 14th. And he was more interested in getting me in that group in his side of the family of the same birthdays than having my real birth time on my birth certificate.
Okay.
So that influence started very early in this
All
life.
right.
And
Yeah.
then career-wise, um, it was almost like if you don't follow their path of being either a doctor or a nurse, then you're on your own. And as a baby Scorpio, that just felt very traumatizing because they're like my foundation. So I ended up picking the same career as my dad, and I as ICU nurse. And when I had first picked up my training, I went to the same unit that he had trained in and worked in for 20 years. And his everyone, every single coworker that worked with him loved him, and which was interesting because he gave his love at his work, but at home he was very, very strict. And so I saw a different side of him that was hidden from everyone else. And then even though he had left my life for the first 3 years of my life, and when he had come back in, that's when I felt like all the rules and whatnot that come with the fourth house and building a foundation. Um, and then what's interesting is the last 3 generations on his side, the eldest daughter that has been born for each generation has gotten breast cancer. And I'm
Mm.
just recovering from breast cancer. I just got my mastectomy like a month ago,
Wow.
in the same house that my grandma also had breast cancer twice. And it's almost like I have to unearth and face the emotional trauma that come with the family. And unless that generation, whoever gets it, faces it, it kind of just comes back. So yeah, that
Yeah.
stellium is very prominent in my life. And it's undeniable that it goes back to the roots and ancestral part of it. And inheritance, that is like the genetic trauma inheritance, but there's also property inheritance, jewelry inheritance. So the inheritance part, it comes in various forms.
And so that's really striking. And then one last
Mm.
piece of it that you wrote in your write-up is that both you and your father deal with death and helping
Mhm.
others heal or pass. And that's actually the fourth house as the end of life and has associations in ancient astrology with death. And while that was mostly shifted to the eighth house, in subsequent traditions, I've noticed that the fourth house, that can still be a major theme sometimes.
Yes, very major theme. My dad and I both, we love and we're comfortable with helping others pass with death. We find it very beautiful and very precious to be the one to take care of someone before they die. And so it's an honor. Um, but yes, that is one thing that my dad and I have in common, and we're both pretty good at it. It is dealing with death in a gracious manner.
And is that does that include in like a hospice type context, or is this
Mhm.
mainly in a like ICU type context?
So I did hospice and I did like a skilled living. And when COVID hit, that's when I saw so much death. And it was quite heavy during COVID. And so but I enjoyed it. So I moved into ICU because there was a need there. So we have both seen it. And he also worked in a prison. Um, but we have both seen deaths in various parts in hospice, in like the living facility, lock psych facility, and then ICU, and palliative care as well.
Got it. Okay. So yeah, that's a major theme. And then one thing that you mentioned I thought was interesting that seems to match a chart placement, but so the ruler of the fourth house of family and ancestry is Mars, which is placed in Leo in the first house on the ascendant. So that would normally show that there's some sort of connection between family and potentially things like your body. And it sounds like there was a very literal manifestation of that you've been dealing with in terms of that genetic inheritance and having to have a mastectomy, which is something that runs in your family. So that in that instance, it was a very literal connection between the fourth house and family and the first house of your body, essentially.
Yes. And I feel like a lot of the cancer was built from resentment and not knowing how to deal with the heaviness that comes from, I would say, like it almost feels like a dictatorship. But if I don't deal with that and let it metabolize and I feel free, then it gets stored up in my body and it shows up literally as cancer.
Mm.
And it's funny that it showed up in the left breast, which both of my grandma and my great grandma also had the first time they got cancer. Um, so yeah.
Yeah. Um, and let's see what else. Do you, in terms of your relationship with your father at this point, has that
Mm.
improved at all as you've gotten older? Was it harder earlier on, or or has it just been consistent?
No. So when I didn't see him, from ages 1 to, so I was with him from 0 months to 8 months. Um, and then from ages 1 to 3, I was mostly on the phone with him while he was in a different country working. And I loved him on the phone. Then when he showed up in person when I was 4, I actually bit him and pinched him the first time I saw him because I did not like the way, like, my mom was all of a sudden more in love with another person, which is very Scorpio, but very possessive. So when I first saw him, I attacked him. Um, and then we sort of got along, but he had a lot of rules that I wasn't used to. Um, so it was kind of challenging from ages 6 to 18, I would say. And then it got worse from ages 18 to 23. Um, then when I started going into my career, I realized there was really no ripping apart from the family because I had so much to learn. Um, and so now I'm learning to love everything and not necessarily have to accept and be the family and be him in order to be kind of get along. But it was a very big challenge internally because I couldn't understand why I couldn't feel at home with him.
Mhm.
Um, but I think it had to do because he, it almost felt unsafe. Even though he was the father, there was a sort of unsafeness, like that theme of not really feeling secure with him. That was in the early parts of my life. And now, as I get older, now I see why he was doing the way, like why he treated me the way that he did. And now I'm starting to appreciate him. Um, so that's kind of been the pattern of our relationship. It's almost like a tug of war of, can I be my own person without really becoming him? And also being able to verbalize boundaries has been quite hard for me, um, with him. And when I see him interact with my other siblings, they all have Sagittarius stelliums and they get along so well. And then here I am with like a Scorpio stellium, and it is so hard to joke and not offend. So yeah, that's been our relationship.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, there's just it's interesting you have Pluto like right there on the IC is just your most angular planet essentially, and just some of the themes that can be such an intense placement, and sometimes those issues with like control or issues of manipulation sometimes coming into play. And then it's also interesting having the North Node there so close to the sun, so that of course like a solar eclipse occurred in Scorpio just like a week before you were born. And I'm interested in how that's shown up in your life, both because it's like that's something in and of itself, like the eclipse of the sun and the sun being hidden, and the nodes themselves in ancient astrology were sometimes called the eclipsing places where something is hidden. And it's interesting that there was this sort of like disappearance of him for a period of time very early in your life that was a really core foundational event and experience for you. And also that Mars, the ruler of the fourth house, is also the ruler of the ninth house of foreign travel. And you said that he traveled and went somewhere else, I guess, for work for a period of
Mm.
time, and how that affected your relationship and your perception of him. But then at the same time, you don't just have a stellium in the fourth house so that there's more emphasis there, but it's like the ruler of your ascendant is there, the ruler of your 10th house is there, and your career has become, and sort of life direction in some ways has been become very much wrapped up in him and what he did for work, so that that's become also to a certain extent what you do for work. And with
Mm.
the Venus there is the most positive planet in your chart, even though it's in Scorpio and it's retrograde. It seems like despite some of the tensions with that relationship and the difficult things, that there's also some positive things in terms of you being able to follow in that line of work and to help other people and to do some really important things in terms of like what you were saying in terms of helping people with their end of life process, and that that's something that you and him share in common to a certain extent, which is a somewhat positive thing in terms of the good work that you're doing in the world.
Yeah, and I just had my Saturn return, and I feel like this year I really kind of established a relationship with him, and I had my first like daddy-daughter moment where I truly felt safe. So it's been a nice round of all these dynamics in the relationship with the father.
Nice. I like that. Yeah, your Saturn at 5 degrees of
Mm.
Pisces and having that exact return over the past that just started a year ago in March of 2023. Um, yeah, and then one thing I noticed also is the eclipses, and I just wanted to ask you about this in terms of the timing. Let me see if this shows up, but I have my handy sheet of eclipses that I released for one of the eclipse episodes. But I was just thinking about how there was these eclipses in Scorpio and Taurus a few years ago that started in 2021 in Taurus and then kept bouncing back and forth from Taurus to Scorpio and Taurus to Scorpio and vice versa all the way through late 2023, and how that would have activated both your fourth house and your family and father axis, but also your 10th house and your career axis. And I was just curious how that lined up in terms of the timing, in terms of your work, as well as your relationship with him.
That's crazy that you're showing those dates. September 2021 was when I actually moved back in with my father. And my ICU contract was from 2021 until I got diagnosed late September of 2023.
Oh,
So
wow.
those 2 years was when I lived in his house as training in the same career at the same workplace. So, wow, I didn't
Yeah.
even realize that.
Yeah, that's incredible. I mean, that's basically how eclipses work, is it just activates these two houses in your chart and sometimes shows the interrelationship between those two sometimes seemingly opposite topics for a period of about a year and a half, or sometimes upwards of like 2+ years, and can sometimes just show you bouncing back and forth between those two things, or sometimes bringing them together in your life in some ways. So that's really striking how that worked out for you in a very specific way.
Yeah, it's quite striking. Yes.
Brilliant. Well, I'm glad to hear your Saturn return has been somewhat
Mm.
challenging because it rules your sixth house of illness, and of course that's come up as part of that topic that you've been dealing with over the past year since that started, as well as potentially some of the themes related to mortality, which also come up with the eighth house. But Saturn, made its last exact hit to your Saturn return earlier this year. And then it's retrograding back to, I think, like 12 right now, and it's going to station and then move on so that we're getting into the later phases of that. And Saturn will start to make its way into Aries eventually. Next year, we get the first ingress of that. So you're most of the way through your Saturn return at this point. And it seems like navigating it well and getting the most out of it that you can. So that's really good.
Yeah, it's been quite a lesson. But I'm excited to see how I can kind of strengthen my foundation. Now I know that I can't truly escape from the house.
For sure. For sure.
Mm.
Well, it's nice having that really close trine between Venus and Saturn, with Venus as like the most positive planet in your chart, and having that close trine with Saturn, I think really helps to offset and to bring some balance to Saturn that it might not have otherwise. So I think that's where you get some of the more positive and constructive things in terms of how that's been manifesting. And yeah, that's a really great example. So thank you for sharing it. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me, Chris.
Yeah. All right. Well, we'll have to check in again at some point in the future, but thanks a lot.
All right.
All right. Bye. All right. That was another really, really good example. And I liked the way that the eclipses tied things together, as you'll see in the third house episode that I haven't released yet, but I will this month. Just paying attention to eclipses and the timing, especially of natal placements and houses that you're studying, can be just so crucial in showing you some of the most important turning points in a person's life, and especially when the natal promise of certain placements will be activated, as well as the tying together of two seemingly opposite houses. I think it's really valuable to pay attention to eclipses for that reason. So I'm going to read through and pull up the next most upvoted story. All right. All right. Yeah, I think that's a good one. Victoria, if you're here, you have the next most upvoted story that was submitted by listeners. Hey,
Hi,
thanks for joining me. What's your birth data?
it's April 26th, 1991 in Asheville, North Carolina,
What time?
11 p.m.
Are you currently in Asheville?
I'm in Greenville, South Carolina right now.
Okay, so you were hit really hard recently.
Yeah, I just got internet and cell reception about a day ago.
Wow, that's terrible. I'm sorry, really sorry to hear that. I hope you and everyone around you is okay.
Yeah, we'll see. I have a lot of family in Asheville, so which is kind of part of my story, but so far everyone's good.
Okay. Is your ascendant 11 degrees of Sagittarius?
Yes.
Yes. All right. So here is your chart. So for those listening to the audio version, we have a chart with Sagittarius rising, and Pisces is the fourth whole sign house, and the degree of the IC is at 26 degrees of Pisces. So what has been going on with you, or what did you want to share about your fourth house?
So I was trying to compile it when you announced that there's going to be a webinar. So I was trying to get the dates all right. But Saturn entering Pisces kind of started the trajectory of everything I'm about to talk about. I have Neptune on my IC. It went retrograde, and it's just been hanging out there. So, but the first week of February 2023, I started taking care of my dad. He had knee replacement surgery, and I was just helping him with his physical therapy. And I started spending more time with my parents, which I hadn't done since I'd been married. And then I simultaneously had started therapy as well. And March 29th, 2023 was when I started therapy, and I realized I wasn't happy in my marriage for a whole slew of reasons.
That's incredible. So this is right after in March of 2023, of course, is when Saturn went into Pisces. So it's like as soon as it went into your fourth whole sign house, a lot of this stuff started coming up.
Yeah, it did. It all started coming out in therapy. And I remember saying specifically to my therapist that I felt like I was buried alive, but I didn't realize it until suddenly I realized it. And I was like, this isn't where I want to be anymore.
How long have you been
But
married?
4 years.
4 years. Okay. So since 2019.
Yeah. Mhm.
Got it. Okay. Um, and so Saturn goes into your fourth house, and I mean, you have Venus there at 16. So that is one of the tricky things sometimes with Saturn transits is it's like when a planet goes into a new house that's squaring that or opposing it, it can kind of activates some of those placements. So you're getting a tension then between a fourth house transit that's also bringing up some tensions with the seventh house in relationships. So that starts happening as soon as Saturn goes into that house, into that fourth whole sign house. And then what happened from there?
I realized that I didn't have control of any of my money. And so in order to get out, I had to get a different job that wasn't commission based so I could start storing money. And then I had to figure out what was my exit plan for getting out. And um, so I got a different job than what I was doing in order to start putting money away. And in July of 2023, I moved in with my parents. That's when I like officially moved out
Okay.
from my marriage.
So that's right after Saturn, because Saturn station did its first station in like late June. Yeah, right here, like mid-June 2015, 2023 is when Saturn made its first retrograde station and like slowed down and stopped in that sign. And then shortly after that is when you moved out.
Yeah, and the date I officially moved out was August 6th. And I think, I'm not sure, it has something to do with my zodiacal releasing. So I thought that was really interesting.
Okay.
Um,
So you moved in with your parents.
yeah.
So that's in of itself also interesting in terms of like parents, not just your home and living situation coming up with this fourth house transit, but also literally like your parents coming back into and playing a major role in your life.
Yeah, I was living with my parents by myself for the first time because I'm the oldest of three, and I never lived with them before by myself. So that was interesting. But I knew I needed to move out and get my own place. I just needed to save up money first, and I'd actually considered moving back to Asheville, North Carolina, and I later stayed in Greenville, South Carolina, where I'm living now, at my parents' request. And I'm glad I did because the next part is March 2024, my mom was diagnosed with cancer.
Oh wow. Oh my God. Um, March 2024, right? 'Cause Saturn retrograded back to zero Pisces and it's stationed direct late in the year and then starts moving forward again. And then right, because March 2024 was also the Mars Saturn conjunction that we just went through. Do you know what the date was of the when that happened?
Let's see. March 6th, 2024 is when me and my siblings got the call from my parents that my mom had cancer that they had just discovered.
Okay. That's really terrible and that's really intense. How did it go and how was your reaction or how did you cope with that?
So she has multiple myeloma, which is a blood cancer that attacks the bones. And essentially they found it because she had a hole in her femur. And it was causing her a lot of pain. And then when her general doctor found it, they said she had to have emergency surgery and she got an iron rod put in her thigh to help her walk. Um, my biggest concern was for my younger sister, who's closest with my mom. She's 25, and so my concern was on her and for my father because my father, I'm just like him, we're super emotional, and so I just knew that he wasn't going to have a lot of support like my mom would have. And so I focused on those two.
Yeah. So you're not living with them still at this point?
Right. Yeah. And
When did
so
when did you move out, or when did you stop living with them again?
it was, I believe, like November 20th, 2023.
Is that when Saturn was stationing? Um, okay, yeah. So you Saturn stationed direct at 0 Pisces in early November. So that connects the two retrograde periods then roughly, is that you started moving out when Saturn was doing its first station retrograde, and then you got back out on your own and moved out of your parents' place not long after Saturn station direct.
Yeah, I haven't put together any of this yet, but that's crazy.
Yeah, that is really crazy. Well, it's something I've always, like, I saw it in my own life how Saturn stations worked like that back in like 2005, but I never wrote it down. And it's something it's hard to document sometimes because you're talking about very long spans of time. But that's kind of how it works. And that's one of the reasons why planetary stations are so important and why we talk about them each month. And I always say that it's like putting an exclamation mark next to the planet, because it's putting an exclamation mark next to the planet in terms of what that transit is speaking about that specific part of your life. And in your instance, it's pertaining especially to your living situation since it's going through your fourth house.
Mm.
Okay, so that brings us back to March and April. Your mom got that diagnosis and then had to start getting treatment for it pretty
Mhm.
quickly, I assume.
It's actually one of the slower moving cancers, but she did a month later start chemo, and it went really well. And so they wanted to postpone her, they wanted to extend her remission because it's autoimmune, so it will come back. So then she had to do a more intense kind of chemo, and
So
with a hospital stay.
and she started a month later, so that means like late
Mhm.
like April.
Yeah. Hmm.
Okay, so that's like when it's like Mars and Saturn are going through at that point, in the fourth house, and then she has that, and then later she has to do a more intensive form of chemo.
Yeah, she had a complication. She had MRSA, and had to go to the hospital for an emergency stay. And she got out. She was well enough, and then that's when she started her chemo again. And she was there for 2 weeks, and the cancer's gone now. So
That's great. When
yeah.
do you know when that sort of all clear diagnosis happened, or what time frame were we talking about for the end of that?
Um, it would have been, I want to say late August. I'm trying to remember. It's been a blur this year.
Yeah, that's okay. We don't have to, you don't have to have everyone. I was just curious. There was that other station that happened at the end of June, which I would think would be an important turning point. And then we are basically hitting the next important station now that Saturn's retrograded all the way back to 12 Pisces, and then it's stationing direct this month in early November. But we've already had the big Pisces eclipse that just took place last month, and obviously that's the most relevant, like, recent thing. I assume, unless there was anything before that, anything else before that.
No, the eclipse was what happened to my hometown.
Yeah. So let me put that up. The transits. So this was the Pisces eclipse, which occurred on September 17th. And one of the things that we said about this, and we talked about a lot in the forecast for that month, is how the Pisces eclipse, since it was occurring right there with Saturn in Pisces and Neptune, that we expected it to kind of accentuate and accelerate some of the transits that were already taking place, that people were experiencing in the Pisces sector of their chart, whatever sector of the chart it was that was hitting. And for you, it was hitting your fourth house. So it kind of exacerbated some of the challenges that were already coming up with respect to those two fourth house topics of, on the one hand, home and living situation, and on the other hand, parents. And then this Hurricane Helene came out of nowhere and just absolutely devastated many, many places. But one of them was actually one of the only towns that I mentioned on the last forecast that we just did for October. Is I specifically mentioned Asheville because one, I saw some videotape of it and it was just absolutely flooded. But two, there used to be like a ton of astrologers that lived in Asheville at one point. I knew like Kelly Lee Phipps lived there, Lee Lehman lived there at one point. So it used to be like a little mini like hub for astrology to a certain extent. There's also I believe there's a Vedic astrologer, Ryan, that lives there that was on the podcast at one point. So I was shocked to see how hard it got hit. How bad was it, or what was the perspective from the perspective of you and your family and your parents?
I actually didn't know about Asheville for a few days because in Greenville, no one had power. We didn't really have cell reception. We definitely didn't have internet. And so I didn't hear about it until this past Wednesday. Um, my mom was actually able to contact her own mother who lives there because they have a different cell service carrier and wasn't able to contact anyone else, but they're totally fine. For as as fine as it can be. I wanted to go and visit and help volunteer and take donations, but it's unsafe to travel there right now.
Mhm.
Um, so I haven't done that yet, but there's plenty of other opportunities to do that here since we're so close in Greenville.
And how, yeah, I forgot to ask about that. How badly was it that your own town was hit?
Um, it wasn't nearly as bad because there wasn't the flooding. It was mostly that there was a storm, a low front that was there before Helene that kind of sat on top of Greenville and Asheville. And so it was a lot of just power lines down, and they couldn't come to assess the damage, whoever they is, they couldn't come to assess the damage to even begin repairing power until they brought in people from out of town to let them know, can we move all these fallen trees, or is there live electricity? Is there live wires here? And so the what took the longest was that they didn't know where they could remove the damage. And honestly, it was just very isolating. I didn't hear from my parents for the better part of Friday because they completely lost cell service. I had to travel outside my apartment to try to send messages, and it was really, really hard.
Yeah, that's really scary.
Mhm.
Um, and then what is your living situation at this point? I mean, aside from getting hit with that, you've been living on your own for the past how long now?
Uh, it'll be a year next month, so it's been about 10, 11 months.
Okay, so that's still something you're getting adjusted to over the past year, and then going through, I assume, like whatever residual stuff in terms of disengaging from that previous marriage that you
Mhm.
went through.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, because that's the other part of this Saturn transit is it's actually, closer to some of those degrees right now, and it keeps just going over and then backing up and going over your descendant at 11 degrees of Gemini and your Venus at 16 degrees of Gemini, which can sometimes bring up sort of residual things there, or sometimes just be part of the process of moving on and separating from something that was, important in your life.
Yeah, the end of my marriage was definitely for the better. Doesn't mean it was fun or easy to get there, but it definitely needed to happen. And then uh, my mom's cancer, def I learned a lot from that. It was something I didn't think I could ever handle, and then I was in a really good position too. Um, and so she's better now. And so, I mean, those are two really hard things, but uh, I feel better about it for the most part.
Good. Um, and in terms of work, because one of the things about that Pisces eclipse is it's opening up um, something that's going to tie together your fourth house and your living situation, or potentially parents, with your 10th house and your career. But we haven't seen that other side of it yet because we just got the initial phase of the first Pisces eclipse in your fourth house with this disaster that happened. But then I think in the springtime, we'll get an eclipse in your 10th house and the potential for some major changes and major new beginnings when it comes to your career and overall life direction. And like with the last chart example that we did, sometimes when eclipses start taking place in the fourth house and the 10th house, events that occur in one house can somehow be connected to events that happen in the other house. So I don't know if any of that is clear or would make sense at this stage. And because we haven't gotten both sides of that eclipse series yet, it may not. But do you have any sense of, I don't know what you're currently doing for work, but do you have any sense of how this change that just happened with that Pisces eclipse happening there could potentially have some implications for your career over the next like year and a half?
Yeah, it depends on whether my grandmother gets displaced from where she is in Asheville because she has health issues. I because my lease ends in about a year, I've already been trying to plan where my next move is. I looked at Asheville, that's kind of off the board now. My job is based in Charlotte. I used to live there. So potentially moving back there or somewhere else. And then my parents had made plans to leave Greenville as well to be closer to my siblings.
Okay, that makes sense. Um, Let me share the eclipse dates again, just to give some idea of what I'm talking about there. So just here's the first Pisces eclipse, and then yeah, you'll get this 10th house eclipse when we get to the next series, but it won't hit your fourth house the first time. So it'll just be a 10th house eclipse, and then you'll get the very last of the Aries eclipse series there in March as well. But then later in the year, circa September, then it's more like the 10th house, fourth house axis again, more fully. We're just one time essentially that you'll get both in basically a year from now. So there may just be some interconnection between things going on with your home and living situation and your career at that point in some way, um, which does not have to be as dramatic as, the a whole hurricane that just hit your hometown necessarily.
Mhm.
But it'll be interesting to see how, in retrospect, that having happened in September was the beginning of sort of like a series of changes that will end up altering your life direction in some significant ways, but that ultimately it will point you in the direction that you're supposed to be headed on because it's connected with your 10th house, which is your career, but also your overall life direction. And that there'll be some events in terms of your career and life direction that wouldn't have happened, where you wouldn't have been pushed in that direction that you need to go if some of those events hadn't taken place. So even though it'll be, some of this recently has been so traumatic and difficult that ultimately you'll look back on it and realize that there was some, I don't want to say necessity of it, but that even though there's many terrible things, that there were some good things that came out of it as a result of some of the changes that you experienced at that time.
Oh, for sure. It didn't feel easy at the time, but it's getting easier.
Sure. Yeah. Well, yeah, and now you're most of the way through that Saturn transit, luckily through your fourth house. And we'll already be getting into the like Saturn and Aries section of things here pretty soon. So it'll be interesting to look back on that retrospect and sort of reflect on it. And yeah, where
Mhm.
are you now? Are you happy and like moving forward into other stuff in terms of relationships and things like that?
Uh, yeah, it's honestly just been focusing on my mom's health and focusing on my job and my career, trying to build that up right now.
Nice. What is your career? I was curious if you can talk. I don't know if you can talk about
Yeah,
that.
it's digital marketing.
Marketing. Okay.
Mhm.
Interesting. I was just curious with the ruler of the 10th and the 5th, um, how that played out.
Yeah, that's a lot. It's mainly social media, but it's a lot of content writing.
Okay, that makes sense. Cool. All right. Well, I think that's a really good example. Thank you for sharing that. I'm sorry you went through that recently and that's all so intense, but I hope that, yeah, that you and your family are able to come out of it and that everything's okay, or that there's some positive changes that end up happening as a result of all of that. Um, just terribleness that's happened that just came out of nowhere.
Yeah. Well, thank you for having me. It was an honor.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for sharing your story.
Mm.
All right. That was another really good one, and that was a really good example of, we try to talk about some of these things on the forecasts in as broad of terms as we can in terms of the mundane things, but that it's a good reminder how some of these transits are hitting individuals in very specific ways, depending on what part of the chart it's hitting and how that can be impacting people. Um, yeah. All right. So let me look and see what the next example is. Okay, so it looks like the most upvoted one next is Daniela.
Hello.
Hey, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
What's your birth data?
Uh, June 2nd, 1988, born at 22:10 in San Ramon.
Um, and is your ascendant 14 Aquarius?
Yes.
All right. So here's your chart. You have Aquarius rising for those listening to the audio version, and you have Jupiter in Taurus in the fourth whole sign house, pretty closely conjunct the degree of the IC at 22 degrees of Taurus. So what's your fourth house story?
I don't know if I have a story per se. I think like my most signature I think I wrote was my dad is one of 20 and my family are a lot of them are farmers. They're in Costa Rica, most of them. Um, and they're relatively wealthy on my father's side, not so much on my mom's side. So a lot of that was inherited. My grandfather was a farmer, and he had the idea of delivering vegetables to other parts of the country. This was in the 1940s, which wasn't 1950s. It just wasn't like a common thing. And the routes that he created are routes that my family still uses to this day because they also have a cheese factory and they deliver cheese all over the country. Cheese in Costa Rica is very like a big deal. So,
Hmm.
and my family is known, funny enough, for cheese.
Okay, nice. So
Yeah.
that became really successful.
Yes, they are. My father was the only one that decided to move out of the country, and we came here February 14th, 2000. But and he moved back at the end of last year in November.
Okay, got it. So part of your example in your description was that your family's very wealthy, mostly on your dad's side. So that's that
Hmm.
that Jupiter placement manifesting there on the degree of the IC. And then interestingly, Jupiter is also ruling the second house of finances, and it's placed in the fourth house of parents. So that's really cool example of the rulers of the houses as well.
Yeah, Jupiter and Pisces allowed me to be able to buy a house. That was during like the COVID times, and I became a travel nurse, and I was able to save up enough that I could purchase a house at the end of when it was December 16th, 2022. That was before I knew about auspicious elections and stuff like that. But funny enough, that chart is a Taurus rising chart when I bought my house.
Oh wow. So you later figured out the time that you bought the house and
Yeah,
found
I wrote it down when I signed the deed. I wrote it down.
nice, and it just happened to be Taurus rising.
Yeah,
I love that. I
it's
love
like
how things line up like that.
it's like 14 degrees of Taurus rising, so it was great. My ascendant, it was perfect. Yeah.
Nice. And when was that when you said that was when Jupiter was in Pisces?
Yes, it was literally like Jupiter and 29 degrees of Pisces. I want to say I bought my house December 16th, 2022 at 1414 in Frederick, Maryland.
Nice. Okay. So Jupiter was, yeah, 29 degrees. and just coming off of a sextile with your natal Jupiter. And oh yeah, and then of course the nodes were moving through Taurus and Scorpio at that time. So that means that there had just been an eclipse in Taurus, like right that immediately preceded that. Um, that would have been here around, yeah, it would have been this one in November. Basically, in November of 2022, you had a lunar eclipse in your fourth house of home and living situation. And then
Yes.
you bought your house literally like the next month.
Yes, I also quit a travel contract around that time because I had a breakup with a boyfriend. So I left a relatively prominent facility here in Maryland and then started a different contract um, that I lasted for a couple of months. Now I'm at a local hospital here.
So you had a job change basically around that time
Yes,
as well.
yes.
Okay, so that ties together the other side of the eclipses that would have been happening at the same time. Think this was one of them. October 25th, 2022 was a solar eclipse in Scorpio, um,
Hmm.
if I have that correct. So that's the 10th house thing. So we're again seeing another thing where a person is having eclipses in their fourth house and their 10th house, and they're having very important turning points happen in both their home and living situation as well as their career at the same time. But for you, those things are happening sort of independently, right? Those two, they're not interconnected, I don't think, are they?
The career and home thing, I feel like it was happening simultaneously. Because I started working that year when those set of eclipses started happening. That's when I got a contract. It was at Johns Hopkins, and I was there for uh, almost a year, but a little bit shortly into that particular contract, I was diagnosed with cancer, and I had to step away from. It was like a month into my contract, and I was diagnosed with cancer, and I had to have emergent surgery and blah blah blah. But in spite of that, I was still able to save up enough money to buy for my house. But it was all happening simultaneously. And towards the end of 2022 is when I saw this house, bought it, but also had to also change contracts.
Okay. I see that
Yeah.
Saturn was like transiting through your first house and over your ascendant at the same time. So when were you
Yeah.
diagnosed with cancer?
That was in August. I'm sorry, August. It was in April of 2022. So that was a Mars perfection year, and that was a little bit shortly after Mars was in Aquarius, I want to say. Or very close to my Mars return is when I had the surgery. So I had surgery April 20th, 2022, and I want to say, I forget what time. I think it was like around noon to 1 o'clock is when I had my right kidney removed.
Oh wow. Okay, that's really intense. And what perfection year was it? What house?
It was Scorpio. It was the 10th.
10th house. Okay. So yeah,
Yeah.
and it's activating Mars. That's
Yeah.
interesting because obviously that's especially the Saturn transit through your first house, especially since you have a night chart. So your Saturn transits are more difficult going through your first
Yes.
house at that time. But then also something we were talking about in the second house episode recently was that there may have been some ancient associations of the body with the second house. Um, More so that kind of dropped off later on. But I wonder if that's relevant here, just in terms of having that surgery at that time when you're having that Mars return. That could be an interesting sort of connection there that might be easy to overlook or could be suggestive.
Yeah, no, for sure. Because it was I didn't have any symptoms at all of the type of cancer that I had. It was a renal cancer, which primarily is in older men, and their blood pressure will go up very high, which is one of the symptoms. I had zero symptoms, and my blood pressure is actually so low that I take blood pressure medication for it. It's worse now after my kidney was removed. So I got a really bad GI bug, and that's how I ended up in the ER. And some of my numbers were a little off. So it was an ER that I used to work at, funny enough. And one of my coworkers was like, "Hey, how about we just get a CAT scan?" They were checking my liver and my pancreas. All that was fine, but then there was this 7 centimeter tumor that was mostly taking up my entire kidney. Like,
Oh
so
no.
yeah, this is happening. Yeah, it was interesting.
Do you remember what the dates were approximately of that ER visit?
I do, but I don't know if I step out of Zoom, if it's gonna like mess it up. Have it somewhere.
I guess I'm just guessing it was around the time of that Mars Saturn conjunction in your first house around maybe.
Yes, it was like end of March. End of March, beginning of April. Just I delayed the surgery a little bit because I had to figure out, I was a single mom. I had to figure out what to do with my daughter. And
Got it.
I was lucky enough that my family, one of my aunts from Costa Rica, was able to fly in, and she took care of me basically the entire time. She's retired. So
Nice. Um,
mhm.
yeah, I see the Mars Saturn conjunction went exact around April 5th, 2022. So that's right in that time frame.
Yes, it was around that time. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Well, are you better now?
Yes, no cancer. Just I have a different. I have a chronic disease that's gotten worse. It's called POTS. My blood
Mm,
pressure just now cannot be regulated as well, just because I am missing that one kidney, so I'm very prone to dehydration. I get IV fluids every so often.
got it. Okay.
Yeah.
Um, and then you bought your house later that year when that eclipse took place. And then yeah, and then that eclipse series finished up in late 2023 because I think there was one more eclipse that took place in Taurus. Were there any like residual things after you moved in to that house that were still going on, either in terms of changes with your home and living situation or in terms of your parents in, let's see, I think it was October, yeah, October of 2023. Looks like the eclipse
Uh,
was around October 28th, 29th.
my dad left, like moved back to Costa Rica shortly. I want to say like 2 weeks after that. Um, and he left the same day he came to the United States. It was in November 1999. So he moved, like he quit, he retired, and he moved back to Costa Rica.
Wow, that's incredible.
Hmm.
So the
Yeah, I mean,
eclipse,
it was a bummer, but we're happy for him.
yeah, I mean, that's a pretty good run, 1999 to 2023. That's like 24 years.
Yeah.
Um, and then so that eclipse is him taking off. So it looks like Uranus was at 21 degrees of Taurus at that time. So it was right on top of your IC at 22 and your Jupiter at 20 Taurus. So that's part of it as well.
Yes.
Yeah. Wow. Okay, well, that's a pretty amazing set of examples of, again, like fourth house and 10th house stuff, and the fluidity between the fourth house representing the home and living situation on the one hand, and then on the other hand, the fourth house also representing the parents, and how under major transits, I think we've seen in both this example and the last one, how, both topics can come up during the course of important fourth house transits, that it's not
Mhm.
always just like one thing or the other, that sometimes it can be both.
For sure.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you for sharing that example. I appreciate it.
No problem. Thank you for having me on.
Of course. All right. That was awesome. I think we are getting we're we're coming up with some really interesting stuff and really deep stuff about the nature of the fourth house, I feel like at this point. Um, and in terms of seeing that interconnection with eclipses, seeing eclipses sometimes accentuate ongoing transits that are already there. In that instance, the eclipse, just by virtue of happening in the same sign as transiting Uranus, was helping to accentuate the Uranus transit that was happening over the IC. Um, yeah, that's really interesting. If you're really looking to deepen your studies of astrology, then check out my Hellenistic Astrology course, which is an online course in ancient astrology. It's perfect for beginner and intermediate students because I take people from basic concepts up through intermediate and advanced techniques for reading birth charts. There's over 100 hours of video lectures, including monthly webinars and Q&A sessions. And at the end of the course, if you complete the final test, you'll receive a certificate of completion saying that you studied with me. You can find out more information at theastrologyschool.com. All right, I'm back. This is going really well in the sense that we're finding some really amazing examples, and this was completely impromptu. So that's one of the reasons why I love these, not just these work sessions, but I like the impromptu work sessions because you don't really know what you're going to get. But I always find with astrology that when you sit down and talk to a person about their life, their chart lines up so well with their lived experience that it's always really striking and really, really powerful to have those conversations directly in person. So I'm really glad that that's part of what's happening here today. All right, so let me see who the next most upvoted one is. It looks like Tasney, that you're the next most upvoted one if you're still here. All right. Hello.
Hi, how are you?
Hey, I'm excellent. This is going great today. What's your birth data?
It's January 3rd, 1974,
January 3rd, 1974. Okay.
and it's 6:57 a.m., and that's in Malden, Massachusetts. Malden.
All right. Is your ascendant 7 degrees of Capricorn?
Yep, that's it.
All right. So let me share your chart. So for those listening to the audio version, we have a chart with 7 degrees of Capricorn rising. The sun is Mercury is at 9 degrees, conjunct the ascendant, and the sun is at 12 degrees. So this is actually kind of a tricky example because the sun is close enough to the ascendant that it might be a day chart, although it's right on
So
the border.
I was going to tell you, my belief is that it's a night chart, and that's because when I run a lot of Eros, the night chart feels like it makes more sense.
Okay.
But no, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it very well may be. It's like right there on the border. So that would be
Yeah,
really interesting if your experience is that it's more of a night chart, then that's a good data point.
yeah,
Okay. So, and then in terms of your fourth whole sign house is Aries, but your
yeah.
IC falls in Taurus in the fifth whole sign house at 3 degrees, and it's conjunct Mars at 3 degrees of Taurus and the moon
Mm.
at 4 degrees of Taurus. So what is your example that you wanted to share?
Yeah, so I was a competitive figure skater and a classical music musician in my childhood, and my father pretty much ran my life like in a very controlling way when I was a child, like brought me to all my lessons and sat in on everything and was like he was the rink dad that sat in the hockey box screaming at me across the rink. And so it was like really intense. Um, and uh, you know,
Was he like was he a former skater or something himself, or where did that come from?
no, he was a former musician and just
Hmm,
never had the opportunity. So I think he was a former athlete as well, and just never had the opportunity. Like he grew up in the inner city, and I think felt like he never had a chance to shine. So it was like, I'm gonna have my kid shine,
got it.
you
So
know.
it's one of those sort of like living vicariously through the
Mm,
kid.
yes, yes, very
Okay,
much so. Yeah,
interesting. So, all right. So maybe that's partially like Mars ruling the fourth whole sign house being placed on the IC in the fifth house and some of that sort of energy coming through there.
yeah. And then when I was a teenager, I started to like lose interest in these things because it felt forced. And I ended
Mhm.
up developing, I was always injured and always having a lot of pain and issues. And I ended up leaning on of that to quit because he wouldn't let me quit. And it was almost like I was, later, after working with like therapists and things, I think it was like the pain was my way out. It was like weird. But I always thought it was interesting, Mars, the energy of Mars with that. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, for sure.
And the IC being there too, like I have a lot of, pain and issues physically with like when I try to do the music and the skating. Like I did become a coach and I was a successful coach as like a side job for many years and had a team that won championships and did, quite a bit of work there too. Um, And then when I had my son, and I know I feel like this is fourth and fifth, but when I had my son, he had a lot of health issues, and so I ended up having to leave that and kind of caretake my son and I had gotten a divorce, so I had to like put all my resources into supporting him, and he had some special needs, so I ended up having to like not be able to buy a house in order to like get him into a special school for a while.
Interesting. Yeah.
Mm,
That's a pretty striking connection there between, because if we are just looking at the fourth house, we see Aries is there, and in terms of like home and living situation, and it's ruled by Mars, which is in the fifth house. And so the delineation, that's a really interesting combination then of that in terms of how that worked out, that you couldn't buy a house for a period of time because you had to focus on, or you had to spend the resources on your child.
yeah. And then
Uh,
I know when Uranus, the one other thing I had mentioned in the chat was when Uranus made its last little tiptoe back into Aries there, my dad had a sudden health issue and passed.
oh wow.
So that was a
And
few of my examples.
so was that at the beginning of Aries or the end of Aries?
The end, like the very last retrograde back in there.
Interesting. That's actually okay. So I'll pull up the transits. Do you know the time frame of that?
Let me think. I want to say it was March of 2019. It was like right before COVID because I remember that he never had to deal with COVID, which was a blessing.
Okay, yeah. So in mid-March, Uranus is,
Oh, you know what? Actually, I'm sorry. It was like yeah, it was January.
yeah. Okay. Well, there's actually a Mars. It's like Mars was also
Mm,
transiting through your fourth house at that time for
yeah,
literally starting January 1st, 2019. And then, oh, right, I remember this because then Uranus stationed also at the beginning of that month on January 4th. Um, So yeah, you're right. Uranus did retrograde back into Aries stations, and then it's not long after that station. And
yeah.
did you say the date? Sorry, or wait.
I know I don't have the exact date, but I know it was like the end of January.
Okay. So I was just curious how close it was to this Mars Uranus conjunction that occurred in like late January, early February. Let's see what else was going on. Yeah, so I mean that does.
The other thing is Uranus is like right near, it's almost exactly opposite that Mars too. I mean, it's not super close, but
Oh, your natal. So this,
natal
right.
Uranus is like opposing it near the midheaven there.
Yeah, that's a really great point. So that was the tail end of your Uranus opposition, and your father passed away, and it was a sudden, unexpected thing. What happened again that made it sudden or unexpected?
Well, so he had had a stroke when I was 19, and so he wasn't in great health from then on, but then he had like an infection. We thought it was just like a bladder infection or something. He went into the hospital, and then like all of a sudden he started having trouble breathing. And they just weren't able to get it. He Because of his stroke, he had like early onset of dementia. And I think when you're a stroke victim, it can affect your gag reflex. So there were complications, but none of like, we just were like, oh, it's just a bladder infection. And then it was like, oh, we're going to have to put him on life support. And I'm like, what?
Hmm.
So he was otherwise doing okay.
Right. Yeah, that's really intense.
Yeah.
Um, so, and then that's interesting just in terms of it's like natally Uranus, it's not super close, but it's basically conjunct the midheaven, which means it's also opposing the IC, and so that there's almost like a natal Mars Uranus opposition there that's on that axis, and then there's not a full recurrence, but just that signature comes back around again at that point when there's a Mars Uranus conjunction in the fourth whole sign house, but just pretty near the IC when that happens. Um, yeah, that's really rough. I'm sorry to hear that that happened.
No, thank you. Yeah. Well, a long time ago, but or feels like it, but yeah.
Yeah. Um, all right. And then you said that you ended up having a successful skating career and music career, but then you sort of rebelled and moved away from that. What did you end up doing otherwise?
So I've had multiple careers. I currently work in accounting. That's probably my Venus and my ruler of my 10th house there in the second.
Right.
Um, but I've always had like a couple of different. I studied engineering, so I have an engineering degree. I went back and did accounting, and obviously studying this astrology too. But yeah, I always think my 6th house is Gemini, and I wonder if that's why I'm always doing multiple things.
Yeah, that could make sense with Mercury conjunct the ascendant. That's interesting
Yeah.
that accounting is one of the main things that you settled on, though, just with the ruler of the 10th being Venus in the second house of money and finances.
Yes, yes, yep. And I'm great. I always tell people my Saturn return, I had like all this credit card debt and I basically moved home, got rid of it all, and now I'm like, don't use credit cards and have excellent control of my finances. And I people come to me for help with it because I have some
Nice.
systems I use. Yeah.
And that was part of your Saturn return?
Yeah. Yeah.
Huh. Interesting. Okay. So with Saturn ruling like the first house and the second house and placed there in Cancer in the seventh, that was part of what was getting activated at that time.
Yeah. 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 It's fascinating.
Yeah, that is really interesting. And then the last thing I was just trying to understand, because a lot of what you described, I can understand the Mars component of it with, um, let's switch back to just the natal chart itself. I could understand the pushiness part of it if he was like a former athlete that didn't get to achieve as much athletic success as he wanted, and therefore he pushed you to as a manifestation of that Mars on the IC. But it almost sounded like there was like some Pluto stuff going on there at the same time, and I was trying to understand because Pluto's not really configured to that stuff, but it is configured. It is in your 10th house at 6 degrees of Libra and is squaring your ascendant and Mercury and Sun, as well as your Saturn, not super widely, but I assume that's part of that constellation of stuff at the same time that was coming up in terms of some of those early feelings of being pressured or like controlled by your dad and like pushed into doing some of these things.
Yeah. Oh, well, so what's coming to mind as you're talking? So I had decided that I didn't want to be a musician professionally. Like I got a full scholarship to be a musician, and I was like, I'm in so much pain, I can't like do this. So my father basically said to me, well, if you want to go to college and major in liberal arts, and please don't cringe anyone on the here that's done that because I think it's a great career, but he basically
Mhm.
told me if I didn't do engineering, I would have to go to a local college, like state school. And I was like, I wanted to get as far away from home as possible. So I was like, I'll do engineering. Sure. How far can I go? Um, so
Right, because otherwise he wouldn't pay for it.
right, right.
Got it. Got it. Okay.
And
Um,
he's been correct that it was a great degree to have. A lot of people think I'm really smart because I have it, but I, got to my senior year and I was like, I don't want to do this.
right. Yeah, I wonder, because you were also talking about some of the injuries and stuff that you had at that time when you're a teenager, but that you also used some of that to get out of that. And I
Yeah,
wonder, some of that is also, I think, partially indicative of just the ruler of the ascendant being Saturn in Cancer
yeah.
that's retrograde right there. And then
Hmm.
somewhere in the middle of your teens, you would have had your Saturn opposition, which everyone goes through around 14 or so, give or take, for a few years when Saturn would have been transiting through your first house and then opposing that placement while hitting some of your first house planets, including your sun. And I just wonder if that wasn't some crucial turning point when it came to some of that stuff as well.
That's around when the pain started to get really bad, was like 14, 15. And like I'd be, in concerts, like I got to play at Symphony Hall in Boston. I'd be on stage and I'd have Ben Gay and like in between movements, I'd be throwing it on my shoulder and it was like, oh my God, I can't live like this anymore. So I would say that's around the age when I was like, I but I didn't feel strong enough to rebel against him. So it was like I said, I think, oh, I can't, I'm in pain, I can't practice. No, I don't want to.
Right.
And then
What
when
was,
he, oh, go ahead.
in terms of using like Bengay and stuff, what was the nature of the ailments that you were having?
I had a lot of neck and shoulder pain because like the violin, I played the violin. And so it was like all like neck and shoulder up here, like with the way I was playing and like holding all my stress up here. When I was skating, when I was younger, it was more my knee. But I have a lot of joint, like residual neck and shoulder joint issues, which I
Got
always
it.
think is that Saturn Capricorn.
Yeah,
But
for sure. That's definitely some Saturn stuff. Um, that's really interesting. And then the last point is the ruler of the seventh. Um, so the ruler of the fourth is in the fifth, and you said that at one point you had to not buy a house in order to just reallocate resources to raising your child. Did that change at some point, or were you able to eventually buy a house at some point?
no, I just finally put my son into the public school, and I'm kind of hoping between now and the Aries eclipse in the spring that I'll have an opportunity to buy something. I've been looking, but I just switched his school, which we went through all that Pisces energy that's been going on for me. Has been kind of ringing true for me with that journey. My son also has had multiple surgeries and things. So again, interesting with the Mars moon.
What's the nature of his, like, what are some of his ailments?
So he was born with something called malrotation where his intestines weren't connected properly. So he had a surgery to correct that. And then when he was 1.5, he had emergency surgery because part of his colon died. Um, and they had to remove part of it. And we were in the hospital for like 6 weeks. And then I would say, he had a lot of anxiety and issues from that. He forgot how to walk. So I feel like he's just starting to catch up with the other kids now. Like he's been in pretty good health now, just a lot of residual stuff from that. But
Got it. Okay.
yeah.
And then there was some recent surgeries that had to take place as well.
Yeah, they had missed a piece, they had to go back in. And then he had esophagus issues. His esophagus had a congenital issue. They had to stretch it. So like he's just had a lot of poor kid, had a lot of stuff.
Yeah, that's a very literal, like having had a lot of surgeries is a very literal manifestation of Mars in the fifth house, and just the symbolism of that, since Mars is, ancient. One of the symbols for Mars in like ancient Egyptian text is just a knife, and yeah, having the combination of that with the fifth house there is a very just literal manifestation.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
No,
All
makes
right.
sense.
Well, you will have, yeah, one more eclipse in Aries early next spring in your fourth house, and just in terms of bringing that series of eclipses between your fourth and your 10th house to completion that's been happening over the past year or so. And in terms of just different situations with your living situation. And I guess the previous eclipse series was the Scorpio Taurus one, which would have been in your fifth house when it was happening in Taurus, but also on your IC. So I assume that was also some of the stuff you're going through in terms of that over the past few years, and in terms of some of the surgeries and things like that.
Yeah, well, he's needed like different therapies and things, and then, just dealing with his anxiety, and trying to get him assistance. Like I put a lot of work into like arranging appointments and getting him to this specialist and that specialist and trying this medication. And like, so like, I feel like that, sometimes that Mars, I can be a little bit of a bull in a china shop, so to speak. So sometimes I'm like, I'm gonna fix it, fix it, fix it, and with him. So I'm trying to mellow out a little.
Yeah, that's a pretty common Mars thing, is especially I see that by transit. Just when a person has a Mars transit through a certain house, suddenly they're having to expend a lot more energy in that area of their life compared to other areas. So sometimes that can be a good keyword or theme for wherever Mars is placed in a person's chart, that they often end up having to put a lot of energy and focus in that area of life, more so sometimes than other areas.
Yes, yes, yeah. I haven't. It was funny. Like after he was born, I pretty much like I've not done any music and any skating. And I probably with the last eclipse in that fifth house, I started doing a little bit. I joined a singing group so that I was at least doing something creative, that because I love that stuff. And with the moon there, obviously, I always like to have my foot in something like that. So
Yeah. Well, and having the moon there in the fifth house and having it exalted, something I was talking about earlier today in a webinar I did for students of my Hellenistic course is oftentimes when you have an exalted planet, the person will do the highest form or like the highest version of that that's possible.
yeah,
So I
yep.
assume that was part of it for you, was like excelling in that area or doing a good job in terms of your creative endeavors there, whether it was with your music or with your skating.
Yeah, so one of the skating teams that I coached, we went to Europe several times. We won 7 national championships, 3 World Cups. Like, yeah, skating's like a knife on ice. Yeah, that's true. I just saw someone's comment there, but yeah, and with the violin, like I said, I played in Boston Youth Symphonies, got scholarships and stuff. So like, and I'm an overachiever. When I have the drive and the will to want to do something, I like make it happen. Like, yeah.
Nice. That's incredible. I love that. That's a really great manifestation of that placement. And yeah, at different points, that'll become reactivated again. It'll be interesting to see what you do at different points when you're able to lean back into that again at different stages in your life
Mm,
and really accentuate that great exalted moon placement that you have in the fifth, and the ability either to produce things yourself or creative things, or sometimes to maybe like host or manage, because that's another function of the moon, is the collective function of the moon and its ability to um yeah, help people in that sort of administrative faculty, like you did with having a team of people that were being successful with skating and things like that.
mm. Yeah, that sounds awesome. I'm looking forward to getting back into it as my son's getting a little less dependent on me, which is
Yeah,
better every day. So it's good.
excellent, good. Awesome. Well, I think that was a really good example. Thank you very much for sharing your chart with us. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Of course. All right, take care.
Yeah, you too.
All right. That was a great example. Let me see where we're at and what the next most upvoted ones are that have been submitted through the Q&A section. Maybe Adam, it looks like yours is the next most upvoted one, if you'd like to join me and if you're still here. Hey,
Hi.
what's your birth data?
Birth date is April 12, 1975,
All right. What
and
time
that's 8:55 p.m.
and what city?
in Mountain View, California.
All right. That is San Bernardino.
Mountain View.
Yeah,
Um,
do you know what like county it is? It's giving me 3 different counties.
it might be. It's in like the South Bay area, so like Santa Clara.
Okay. Yeah, Santa Clara is one of them. I'll go with
Okay.
that. Is your
Perfect.
ascendant approximately 8 degrees of Scorpio?
Yep.
Cool. All right. So let me share your chart for those watching the video version. For those listening to the audio version, we're looking at a chart now with Scorpio rising, and the fourth house is Aquarius, where we find the degree of the IC at 14 degrees of Aquarius. And the ruler of the fourth house is Saturn, which is placed in Cancer in the ninth house. And this is a night chart because you were born almost at 9 o'clock at night. So, what's your fourth house example that you want to share with us?
Yeah. So I understand my fourth house mostly in terms of Aquarius, and then through some study, I'm thinking about it in terms of my ninth house Saturn as well. So my mom was an astrologer, so I feel pretty good about my birth time. Um,
Nice.
she actually had Aquarius rising at like 15 degrees of Aquarius, so she's definitely represented right there.
Oh wow,
Um,
that's incredible.
yeah,
So your mom's ascendant is the degree of your IC.
yeah, exactly.
Wow, that's impressive. All right, and already we're manifesting that ruler of the fourth house and the ninth house with your mom being an astrologer. The ninth house is the place.
First.
The ninth house is the part of the chart that deals with astrology.
Yeah. So yeah, interestingly, she was born to a Jewish family, raised Jewish. She had a difficult childhood, and so she left as soon as she could, and that looked like essentially running away in New York City at 18 to Greenwich Village, where she discovered the Hare Krishna movement as it was just beginning. So she became a Hare Krishna at that time. And then something like, I guess, 7 or 8 years later, she had me. My dad's Catholic, so the house, our family was just all over the place in terms of religion. So I find that interesting with, it's Saturn in the ninth connected to the fourth.
Yeah,
So
absolutely. So it's like if somebody, because the most basic thing somebody would say about your chart if they sat down and they were trying to look at the rulers of your houses is they would look at your fourth house and they would see that the ruler of the fourth house of home and parents is in the ninth house of religion and philosophy. And they would say, there's some strong connection between your parents and the topic of like religion, philosophy, education. And if somebody even just made the most broad statement like that to you, it would actually be stunningly specific in your case.
yeah, absolutely, yeah. Um, yeah, so as our family was just kind of like we didn't fit in any any traditional categories, religious wise, or and it was so I don't remember it as particularly challenging, but it definitely like set me apart. So it was unique in a lot of ways in that sense.
So you wrote that your early family life was characterized by being outside of any traditional religious experience or background. So that's kind of interesting just because, Saturn's also in Cancer, which is in some of the ancient traditions, they would refer to a planet being opposite to its domicile or its home sign being in exile. And sometimes these themes of being like outside of things or as far away from and on the periphery of things as possible. But so you didn't experience that as negative necessarily, but you at least had some conceptualization that things were different for you in terms of your religious upbringing compared to like people around you or compared to your contemporaries.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's tough. I mean, I think I handled it fine, but I guess as if I think back, it was probably something I didn't really advertise, right? It wasn't like going around bragging about my mom being a Hare Krishna. It was kind of a weird thing, and I probably did kind of want to fit in and sort of be seen as a little more normal. But even without the Hare Krishna, right, just having a Jewish mom and a Catholic dad meant we were celebrating either like all of the holidays or or none or other things. So it was
Right. That's incredible. And for those like not familiar with Hare Krishna, um, what was some of the things that are entailed in that or how far, because I think there's like different levels of how
yeah.
deep into things people are. So how far into that did she go?
She was pretty deep. I have a couple of older brothers who were actually sent away to a Hare Krishna school. They're 7 and 8 years older than me, so they were. Um, I guess it was before I was born when I knew them. They were at home, um, but she was, for a while living in a temple, and so sort of all in. And then
How far away were they sent?
the school was in Texas, and we were living in California. So
California. I mean, that's incredible since Saturn's also ruling your third house of siblings. So it's like not just ruling your fourth house of home and parents, but it's also ruling your third house of siblings. And your siblings were literally sent to another state, another part of the country for essentially for like religious training.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, they started to learn Sanskrit. Yeah, so Hare Krishna in the late 60s and through the 70s, it was kind of seen as a cult. It's really, as I understand it, I'm not involved in it in any way right now, but it's sort of an American offshoot of a pretty kind of standard Hindu, a branch of the Hindu religion. And so, a lot of people practice it, and it's not particularly cultish, or in a lot of ways, but at the time it was a represented a big challenge to like American society, and it was just seen as shockingly strange. Like, what are the kids doing?
Sure. I'm not like super familiar with it myself, but I know there's another astrologer, Adam Ellenboss, who had some interest in that and has gone a little bit back and forth in terms of being more or less interested in it over the past few years. But it's interesting. Yeah, this would have been like when you're growing up. So we're talking about like the 1980s, basically in that time frame. That would have been much different compared to today.
Yeah, so my mom was getting involved in at the tail end of the 60s, when it was really had just appeared in the United States, and then all through the 70s. I was born in 75, and before and after, she was pretty involved, living in the temple before I was born, and then she left to marry my dad and lead a somewhat more traditional life out of the temple, and in just a regular home. Um, but even as a kid, I would be brought to events, and actually my given name is, my first name is Sanskrit, and my older brothers convinced me to stop using that given name. But that was another one of those things that kind of set me outside.
Did your older brothers eventually turn away from it?
Yeah, they very much did. Yeah.
Okay. So
Yeah.
when did that happen, or how old were they? How old were you? Actually, how old were you when they sort of started rebelling against that?
I was, I think, too young to be able to put a date on it. I would have been, um, you know, 6, 7, 8 when I was starting to understand. Like they lived at home. They were uh, rejecting the names that they had temporarily been using, their first names, and returning to the names on their birth certificates,
Mhm.
and just not interested. Um, and it didn't represent a real conflict in the family, that particularly. My mom just sort of privately continued, like, observing and considering herself an adherent of the Hare Krishna for the rest of her life, but she didn't practice in the same ways as she did when in my earliest childhood and before I was born.
So she did like cool down on it a little bit in terms of intensity, but still maintained that for the remainder of her life.
Yeah, I think she heard me describe her as like a former Hare Krishna, and she got kind of upset and corrected me. And she was like, "No, I am." So that clarified things for me.
Was it your siblings rejecting it? Was that part of the catalyst for her like toning it down a little bit?
Um, I'm not sure if that was. I think it was probably deciding to marry my dad, because I think if you're living in the temple, I think you're not involved in partnered relationships. I'm
Mm,
fuzzy on this, and I may be misspeaking, but I think she was deciding to, you know, go in her own direction a little bit with her Aquarius rising, and make
got
some
it.
choices about what tenets she's going to follow and what she's not, as far as the religion.
Right. And your dad also had a interesting backstory that was kind of ninth housey as well, right?
Yeah, just as I was kind of collecting some thoughts about this, it occurred to me, his family background was just like working class Polish in a small town in New Jersey, where the town was essentially all Polish immigrants. He was the first in his family to go to college, and that kind of set his life on a different path, and provided him with more income, more opportunities, and so he didn't return to live in that town where all the previous generations of his family had lived, and his sister lived there, still lives there. Um, so yeah,
It
but
was
he
what was the town? Or what
it's a
part of
small
the
town in New
country?
Jersey. Yeah, like
Okay.
middle New Jersey.
So
Yeah.
Jersey. And then was California, is that where he went to school, or where did he end up going to school?
He had a kind of a tricky journey with college, as did I, with Saturday Night House. But I think he initially went to Michigan and dropped out. I don't remember what school, but then he ended up in California, where he got a degree at a community college, which I
Got
believe,
it.
as I'm saying it out, I believe my mom paid his tuition. She worked and paid the tuition while he went to school. So
Okay.
yeah.
That's interesting. So yeah, I was just curious about that because that's basically that kind of brings up some of those themes again for me of Saturn being opposite to its own sign. Saturn is basically as far away from its home sign as it could get, and your dad pretty much moved as far away from New Jersey as he possibly could to go to school while still being in the continental United States. He moved from like New Jersey to California, and then that presumably is where they end up settling because then you're born in Mountain View in
Yep.
1975.
Yeah, we lived there until I was about 5 or 6 years old. But yeah, they settled there, had a couple of houses. Um, but
Okay.
yeah, I had fond memories.
That's incredible. Well, there's just so many different ways that like the archetype of that Saturn placement that draws in so many different archetypal meanings through its house rulerships, through its sign placement, through sect, through all sorts of other things in the ninth house. Like those different archetypes are all manifesting, they're trying to like manifest in different ways in your life, and they are manifesting in different ways that are unique, but they're still consistent with like the overarching archetype. So that's really fascinating. And um, you also have the ruler of the ninth house, which is Cancer, and the ruler is the moon, which is in Taurus in the seventh house. I don't know that that's applicable or if it's too much of a stretch, but it's interesting that you said that your mom paid for your father's college tuition in order to help him complete that.
Yeah.
I don't know entirely why that's showing up in your chart, but that might be relevant there in some way. And then has that I think you said that's come up in your life to a certain extent as well.
Yeah, well, I didn't complete college. I had a tough time in like early education. I was just terrible at doing homework. And
Mm.
then I did 3 semesters in college, but my attention turned to like the World Wide Web in 1993 and 1994, and I was still a terrible student, so so I never got a degree.
That's a good time to be developing an interest in the internet.
Yeah, it served me well. Yeah, my career's been in tech, and that's been great.
Okay, but that's
So,
amazing that you manifested again like the ninth house placement of Saturn there in a night chart and that you basically like dropped out of college.
yeah, yeah, totally. Yeah, I've puzzled. I've just learned about sect recently, and I've puzzled over Saturn. I've always found it not to be terribly negative for me. Like try to figure out what happened with my Saturn return, and it was like I got a better job and I bought a house. And I don't remember anything that was extremely difficult about that time. But I guess maybe it's the support from the from that moon in an applying sextile or something that helps a lot. But
Yeah, it's that and also the benefics. So it's like both of the benefics are a few signs earlier than Saturn, so they're both in a superior position overcoming Saturn, and therefore one of Saturn's basic functions is one of the things it's trying to do is it's trying to reject or say no to things. So one of the things it said no to was, for example, college for you, where you yourself ended up rejecting it and saying no and leaving college. That's a very Saturnian type thing. But the benefics with Jupiter in Aries is in the 10th sign relative to Saturn. So it's overcoming Saturn and it's forcing Saturn to be a little bit more positive and constructive than it would be otherwise. And then the other benefic, Venus, even though it's so late in the sign in Taurus, it's still in a superior sign-based sextile, overcoming Saturn, which is additionally making it a little bit more positive than it would be. And then finally, the last thing is Saturn has that reception with its exalted ruler, which is the moon exalted in Taurus at 9 degrees, and it's applying to that sextile with Saturn at 12 degrees of Cancer. So having that sort of support from a very well placed domicile lord that's co-present with Venus is a very good counterbalancing situation that you've got going on there. I mean, that doesn't necessarily remove some of the difficulties of Saturn. And even though you didn't experience it entirely yourself, it sounds like your siblings, for example, with Saturn ruling your third house of siblings and your fourth house of parents being placed in the ninth house, that they did struggle with that to some extent, that there was some extreme sort of like religious views or observances that were kind of thrust on them to a certain extent that it sounds like that they didn't fully appreciate early in their life, or that they experienced as being subjectively negative in some sense, if they ended up rejecting it and even encouraging you to reject it at a certain point as well.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. It makes a lot of sense. Yeah, all three of my brothers had a real tough relationship with my mom, and mine was always just wonderful. So that was odd. But yeah, my two older brothers, they had a different dad. And yeah, they very much just moved on to completely different lives from kind of, where we started. So
Got it. Yeah. Um, it's like part of the lesson from that is like sometimes certain parts of the chart, especially things like the ruler of the ascendant, are about you, and the first house is about you. But sometimes other parts of the chart are not you. They're just they're the people around you who are important in your life. And sometimes the placements are describing things that happened to them or things that happen with them. Um, so I think that's part of what's going on there with your Saturn placement. It's showing that connection between third house of siblings, fourth house of parents, ninth house of religion. And then Saturn has some positive counterbalancing things, but it also has some challenging things, not just the Cancer placement opposite to its domicile or being in a night chart, but also the square with Pluto to a certain extent would also be kind of challenging. And I think that's probably partially descriptive of some of the things that they were experiencing early on in terms of being sent away for that sort of religious training. Um, yeah, I think that
yeah,
makes sense.
yeah.
So yeah, but I guess now as an adult, the only other thing you mentioned in your write-up is just that with your relationship and with your marriage, that you have a different sort of like background, so that some of the ninth house things have been maybe incorporated into your seventh house as well, or what's the deal with that?
Yeah, well, I'm white. My wife is black, and we have three kids that mixed kids. So it's an interracial family, and we're just kind of it's far more common today than it used to be. But it's still again in an entirely different way, sort of outside of any traditional conception or assumption about how a family is going to look. So we find wherever we live, the United States at least is still tends to be very segregated, in terms of neighborhoods and stuff. So we're typically living in either a very majority white neighborhood or a very majority black neighborhood. It's hard to find, a place where your neighborhood kind of reflects the mixed family that we are. So we're always kind of standing out in that sense.
Right. That's really interesting because it's like I see that placement come up other times where the ancient delineations of like ruler of the ninth and the seventh, or ruler of the seventh and the ninth, is like the native marries somebody that's from a foreign country, or the native moves to a foreign country and finds their marriage partner abroad or something like that. But this is an interesting sort of delineation of that archetype of just like having different backgrounds and having that show up, in the birth chart itself, or having that be a component in terms of just your marriage composition in and of itself.
Yeah, I think that's definitely all going on. I see it in the, Aquarius fourth house and the yeah, totally the moon ruling ninth house Saturn.
Yeah. Cool. Well, that's awesome. And that's obviously that's like actually the best part of your chart is just that you have that, Venus in its own sign and moon exalted there in Taurus in the seventh whole sign house. So I would assume that that's part of the part of your life that you probably feel like the luckiest.
Yeah, we celebrated our 25th wedding anniversary this year, so it's going well.
Nice. That's
Yeah,
awesome.
yeah.
I wonder what that was when you I guess I'm getting distracted actually because I want to ask like when you got married and if there's like eclipses happening in your seventh house or how your seventh house is being activated. But I'll restrain myself because I know that would be massively off topic from what we're supposed to be talking about, the fourth house. But that's super cool. Is there any other major things with respect to your fourth house that are worth mentioning? Um, I noticed you did mention your mom in the past tense. Did she pass away?
Yeah, Timing wise, yeah, she died in November 2014. And interestingly, fourth house wise, this was literally 2 weeks after we had just moved into a new home. And I believe that was a fourth house perfection year for me. I haven't looked closely at what else was going on.
November of 2014. Okay, let
Yeah.
me check it out. Um, is it showing the bi-wheel?
Yeah.
Okay. So November 2014. I'm trying to remember what was going on in November of 2014. So, oh right, you were having that Pluto transit. There's a Mars-Pluto conjunction that happened that month. It was exactly opposing your Saturn, which was the ruler of your fourth house, which was always so prominent in representing your mom, and she passed away at that time. Do you know what the date was?
Yeah, it was the 14th. So
Oh, it
you're
was
almost on it right there. Yeah.
like
November 14th.
exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, got it.
Yeah.
Yeah, was that really tough for you, or what was your experience of that?
Yeah. I mean, she was a like an amazingly spiritual person, and she had kind of prepared me well by explaining that like she wasn't afraid to die and that she was still going to be around. So could have been worse, but it was totally unexpected. She wasn't in the best of health, but we weren't like expecting and preparing for her to pass away. It was just I got a phone call that she had um, had like an incident and was taken to the emergency room, and I should come home as quickly as possible. So I hopped on a train.
Oh wow.
So
Okay.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, that's pretty unexpected and pretty quick. Um, all right. And then you think you were in a fourth house perfection year that year?
if my math is right, I think so. Yeah. Let's
How old
see.
were you?
I should have been 39.
39. I'm trying to do the
Yeah.
perfection of 36, 37, 38, 39. Yeah, 39 is fourth house. So yeah,
Okay.
you were not just in a fourth house perfection year, but then you had that really intense Mars Pluto conjunction happening opposite to the ruler of the year. So that's actually pretty
Yes.
classic. And then if that wasn't enough, actually, that's the other element of that is like Uranus, that Uranus was right there at 13 Aries, which was very closely squaring your natal Saturn
Oh,
placement at 12, as well as
yeah.
the Mars Pluto conjunction. So that's the like unexpected sort of random element of it.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. Um, and then you decided to move in the same time frame.
Yeah, we had moved into a new house, still in the same city, but into a neighborhood that we were excited to move into on like November 2nd.
November 2nd. Okay, so you had just moved.
Yeah.
Um, got it. So that's the other part of your fourth house perfection year. Although that's interesting, when you're in your fourth house years, when Saturn's activated, it's also activating your third house still, and it wasn't like a major city relocation. It was like relocating to a different neighborhood.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Totally. Yeah. We'd moved to Philadelphia in about 2007, and then just moved within the city since then. Yeah.
Got it. Okay. Cool. Well, I think that's a really great example. Like that's really comprehensive, and that really brings up a lot of stuff that we hadn't seen before because that's such a unique case. But that's really interesting and really informative just in terms of how the specific placements have worked out for you in such unique ways, and how yeah, how that's characterized your life and how it fits the placement so literally. That's something I sometimes get nervous about. I've always been nervous about when you sit down with a client, you see the placements and you have an idea of how that should work out archetypally. But like if I just was sitting across from you, sitting down for a consultation, you wouldn't immediately expect the placements to work out that literally. So there would still be this feeling of like I guess that I've never gotten over of almost reticence about stating it as clearly as you might if you were trying to delineate that placement. But that honestly, like I said earlier, if a person had just delineated that seeing that connection between the fourth and the ninth as literally as possible, they would have been strikingly accurate just in terms of your lived experience. And I think your example is a really good reminder of that, about how things can work out in surprisingly straightforward ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for clarifying some things about my Saturn. I'm always suspicious. I'm like, why isn't it? Why doesn't it hurt more? What's going on here?
Yeah, I think that it's just that dual thing of what happens when planets are mitigated in a chart, and why paying attention to mitigations is so important, just because it really can offset how a person experiences their certain placements in their chart, especially their challenging ones. Um, but so that's one piece of it. And that's why I have an entire section of my course that I focus on mitigating conditions. But then the other part is also realizing that some of those experiences weren't entirely from you, but instead were experienced by like other people in your life that were important to you, and this sort of dual role that plays. That was a really illustrative example for that reason as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Cool. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing your chart and sharing your story.
Yeah, of course. Thank you.
All right. Take care. All right. That was another great example. So I think we might be to the end of this. Does anybody have any comments or questions as we're wrapping up and sort of bringing things full circle? I would like to keep talking and like going through more of these, but I just did another webinar earlier today, and this was kind of an impromptu one that I wasn't planning on doing. So I'm getting kind of tired, and I want to make sure I'm bringing um, the full energy that I need to for each consultation or each interaction. Otherwise, I will appear as even more robotic than I already do, which is not a plus when we're dealing with such heavy topics. I want to be present for everybody. So, um, yeah. Does anyone have any questions as we're wrapping up, or any points, any like summarizing things, or are we all good in terms of what we learned today? Awesome. People are saying thank you in the chat. Thanks everyone who submitted your examples and for sharing these stories. Like sometimes this can be really intense to talk about, and really, yeah, I know that there's a lot of tricky things sometimes that we're dealing with, but I really appreciate everybody being so vulnerable and being so open about talking about their lives. And having this dual thing of kind of experiencing those things, but also kind of intellectualizing it at the same time and looking at it from this vantage point of astrology. I feel like that's always really helpful. Um, I feel like that's always really helpful, and it always has been for me. I think each astrologer is different, but I think most of us have that experience in terms of even when we're experiencing difficult things in life, sometimes being able to look at it through the lens of astrology and see how the astrology actually does speak to what you're experiencing can be kind of reassuring or kind of helpful as you're navigating some of these difficult things. So yeah, I hope that's been insightful and useful as we've been looking through this today. All right, everybody. Well, we'll see. I know there was a bunch of stories we didn't get to, so I'll see if maybe we'll do a follow-up at some point. This has given me some great ideas, and I'm gonna turn from here to focusing on working on the fourth house example, the fourth house episode next, where I don't know if it's going to be as extensive as the third house. We kind of overdid it and went as extensive and as deep of a dive as possible with the third house example or episode with over 100 examples. So I'm excited to release that. I'm probably going to scale it back a tad bit for the fourth house one. So we'll have to see. But if anybody has any good celebrity chart examples, especially of the fourth house, I'm actively looking for those right now. So please let me know, either by posting on Patreon, posting in the Facebook group, or emailing me at theastrologypodcast@gmail.com, because I'm going to just be intensely focusing on preparing the fourth house episode over the next couple of weeks before I record it. This has given me a lot to think about, and I think we've gotten a much deeper understanding of the fourth house today. So I think that's a great starting point for going into that larger fourth house episode later this month. And we'll see if maybe it might be worth it to do a follow-up at some point to talk with people about some of the other examples that came in today. But otherwise, I think that's it. So thanks a lot, all of you, for joining me today. If you're watching this on YouTube, if you'd like to join me for one of the future live chart reading sessions, all you have to do is become a patron through my page on patreon.com on the live stream tier, and then you'll get a notification each time I schedule one of these events. Sometimes I schedule them in advance. Other times, like today, we just do it as this impromptu thing. And I'm always consistently shocked at how much we learn and how amazing some of these stories end up being by being able to talk with real life people directly. So thanks everyone for sharing your stories today. I really appreciate it. All right, I'm going to go take it easy. Thanks for joining me. I'll see you again next time, and have a good night. If you're a fan of the podcast and you'd like to support the production of future episodes, then consider becoming a patron through my page on patreon.com. In exchange, you'll get access to a bunch of benefits, such as early access to new episodes, the ability to attend live recordings, access to the monthly Electional Astrology Podcast, access to another exclusive podcast called the Secret Astrology Podcast that's only available to patrons, or even get your name listed in the credits at the end of each episode. For more information, visit patreon.com/astrologypodcast. Special thanks to patrons on our producers tier, including Christy Moe, Ariana Amour, Mandy Ray, Angelique Nambo, Issa Sabah, Jeannie Marie Kaplan, Melissa Delano, Sunny Bozboz, Kwatsi Alibarahu, and Annie Newman. If you're looking for an astrological consultation, then we have a new list of recommended astrologers on the podcast website. These astrologers offer birth chart readings, synastry, rectification, electional astrology, horary questions, and more. Go to theastrologypodcast.com/consultations. The astrology software that we use on the Astrology Podcast is called Solar Fire for Windows, and you can get a 15% discount on the software by using the promo code AP15 when you purchase it through alabe.com. For Mac users, we recommend the program AstroGold for Mac OS, and you can also get a 15% discount when you use the promo code AstroPodcast15 at the website astrogold.io. If you'd like to learn more about my approach to astrology, then you should get a copy of my book titled Hellenistic Astrology, The Study of Fate and Fortune, which is available in both print and now ebook forms, where I've started selling a PDF copy of the book through my website at HellenisticAstrology.com/book. If you're really looking to deepen your studies of astrology, then check out my Hellenistic Astrology course, which is an online course in ancient astrology. It's perfect for beginner and intermediate students because I take people from basic concepts up through intermediate and advanced techniques for reading birth charts. There's over 100 hours of video lectures, including monthly webinars and Q&A sessions. And at the end of the course, if you complete the final test, you'll receive a certificate of completion saying that you studied with me. You can find out more information at theastrologyschool.com.